Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh, and a very good morning to professors, lecturers, students of Hasanuddin University. I'm very, very honored and privileged to be here this morning, even though it is an online lecture, to be able to extend a little bit of what I know on, which is not much, what I know on environmental rights of men from a legal perspective. I think when it comes to environmental rights, before I begin with this, I shall just ask you to ponder a little bit, right? To look back and reflect on the environmental pollution experiences that the global world has seen so far. And what has that, those experiences and examples or illustrations have actually made an impact on the evolution of environmental rights in the legal sense. So let me just show you a little bit, you know, on some illustrations, some samples of global pollution that have affected all of us, yeah, in different countries, including Indonesia. Let's just begin with the first one. Hang on, yeah. Just before that, I just ran through a little bit of the summary of content lecture. Yeah, I'll begin with my introduction, of course, and in some illustrations on environmental pollution that we have experienced all over the world. Then I'll carry on with a little bit on the environmental rights of men thus far. And the fourth area which I like to speak on is on the accordance of environmental rights in terms of the national and international perspective. And also, what are the advantages of having these environmental rights? What are the benefits for the public, yeah, for the people in each state to have that environmental rights? And what types of rights are we talking about? I think this is no stranger to many of us, yeah, when it comes to constitutional law, as well as public international law. What do you mean by types of rights, procedural rights, and substantive rights of victims? What are they? How do you apply these rights? And finally, I will look into the Malaysia's aspects and practices when it comes to environmental rights, whether or not Malaysia and also Indonesia, because I'm quite interested in Indonesia's point of view or their stand or your stand on the environmental rights in Indonesia, yeah? Whether you have actually practiced it and whether or not you have any kind of constitutional rights embedded within your constitution. So let's take a look at, like I said earlier, I like to begin by looking at some examples of environmental pollution. Then we can discuss later on as to how these illustrations impact the entirety of the evolution of environmental rights. Yeah. Now, if you can remember, I think Professor would know that this one is a very, it was a landmark case in India, yeah, and this was the world's worst ever pollution, ever industrial accident that happened in Bhopal in India, and that was taken place in December 2nd and 3rd in 1984, when toxic gases actually leaked from a plant, and it had affected many of the residential communities surrounding the pesticide plant in Bhopal. Yeah? Now, what happened was, in this particular circumstances, the pollutants which seeped out from the plant had actually caused cancer and then growth retardation and also dizziness, says some of the Bhopalis. So you can see in the picture that many of them have taken a huge stance against the polluting company. Yeah? And I think there has been some preceding cases when it comes to this. So if you were to see from this picture alone, there is some evidence or semblance of movement in expressing the need for environmental rights, especially from the victims of the environmental pollution as such. Now let's carry on with the next illustration. This one, I think the young ones would know. In 2010, the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, I think most of you can recall from this. The oil rig was owned by ExxonMobil, and this particular circumstances has actually translated into a movie. Does anybody know the movie? Have you seen the movie?
Yes.
Have you seen the movie, The Deepwater Horizon? That is a Deepwater
Deepwater
Horizon.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
We are
Yeah.
aware of
Yeah.
that movie.
Exactly. So has been translated into a movie. Yeah. And I think many of us actually have asked, even my students, to actually watch it, to see the extent of the pollution that was created during the oil spill. Yeah? It was a severe kind of effects, not only to the marine animals, but also it went along the lines of impacting the tourism industry along the Gulf of Mexico. So I think Professor would know that there was a case against the ExxonMobil, and the oil company was sued and was asked to give some kind of reparation. I think it went up to about 60 billion, if I'm not mistaken. So any of you has an interest in this case, take a look at it. It's very interesting to see how they worked out the remedies and awards given for the impacts caused by the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. So the next illustration is, now who knows this place? When we talk about polluted cities, which city in the world is considered as most polluted? But ever since COVID-19 occurred around the world, the city is, sorry, I can't hear you.
China.
In China, exactly. In Shanghai, in Beijing, yeah.
The most
Most,
China.
yeah. Yes, exactly. And what do you think was the cause of the pollution in China? Does anybody know the cause of
About the
pollution in China?
factory.
Yeah.
Factory.
Basically, yes.
Pollution.
Yes.
Pollution. Yeah, factory.
Yes. You see, China has a lot of coal mining, right? That is one of the causes of pollution in the country, as well as vehicles, cars, motorcycles, yeah, transportation, and also factories and refineries as well. So they are choking due to the pollution caused by these sources. They are choking the population in China. But now, you know, the air has cleared, the skies are blue. Hopefully, you know, after this COVID-19 pandemic has been resolved, you know, it wouldn't go back to the prior situation where, you know, the city will get polluted again, because the economy activity will have to run probably 2-3 times faster than before, more than before. Then, you know, it will create another pollution, a very bad pollution in China, for example. Yeah. Okay, the next picture has a lot to do with Indonesia itself. Where do you think this is? Good morning, Dr. Maskun. How are you?
Hi, Hanim.
How are you?
Alhamdulillah, fine.
Oh, good
Okay.
to have you here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wondered whether you know of this place. Any one of you know of this place? It's in West Java, Indonesia. Is in one
Citarum.
of the rivers. What is it? Yeah. What's the name of the river?
Citarum.
Citarum. Yeah, that Citarum River. Yeah.
Yes,
Now,
Citarum
I
River.
think you all know. I think it's best that you tell me what it's all about in the Citarum River.
Yes.
Yeah. So this
Citarum.
Citarum River is the biggest river in West Java. Am I right? Yeah.
Yes.
And it provides drinking water, cleaning water, irrigation water for millions of people in that area. And well, unfortunately, it is clogged with all sorts of waste, including plastic waste. What's the situation right now in that river? Does anybody know whether the government has cleaned up this place?
Yeah.
Does anybody know? It's good to take a look at what's happened in this place here, to see whether or not the government is seriously enough to resolve the issues of this pollution, yeah, caused by all sorts of waste in the river. Okay, the next picture is when we talk about space debris, okay? Now, this is a graphic from the European Space Agency showing how space debris is spread around the planet. We don't see it, of course, you know, but this is the graphic image. And apparently there are an estimated of 17,000 objects circling around the Earth, right? And many traveling at about 30,000 kilometers in an hour. So you can just imagine, you know, if you have a space aircraft, you'll have to go through this debris before you can actually go beyond that, go beyond the skies, go beyond the space. So the experts fear that with all the space debris around the planet, yeah, that will cause a problem for the space aircrafts to live. So then again, how do you manage the environmental pollution that it's caused by space debris? And this space debris is from where, you think? Where does this space debris come from? Do you know? Would anyone know?
Soviet.
Anyone? Ali? Is that Ali? Ali Sadikin? I see
Yeah.
your name. Yeah, where do you think it comes from?
Uni Soviet.
Where do you think it comes
Russia.
from? All the time? Sorry?
Russia.
Yeah, but what type of particles does it come from? You know, because as you know, satellites and rockets, they go beyond the space. And once they come in, they would have to disintegrate, and they will disintegrate. They won't land on the on Earth. They would actually disintegrate and actually circle around the Earth. So that's basically metals, yeah. So how do we get rid of it, right? So that's a question. Now the next illustration is electronic technology waste. Now we are so driven with technology these days, right? From computers to handphones, you know, from everything that has to do with IT, yeah? And as you can see, this is a picture of members of Greenpeace protesting against electronic waste in Mexico, right? So you can just imagine poisonous substances like cadmium, like mercury, like chromium and all that being placed in that junk, and it will cause some kind of a problem in the groundwater or soil because it is being dumped in most landfills. And in Malaysia as well, we have this problem where people just don't do too much of recycling, and they tend to throw away many of this technology waste into dump fields. So it is a problem for Malaysia as well. And the pollution that is caused by these waste is seeping into the groundwater and also the soil, and that causes another problem as well for the pollution of the pollution in Malaysia, and I'm sure in many of the countries in the world. So basically, from all of these pictures that I've shown you, yeah, and this one is the most interesting. I think it affects us most. Indonesia and Malaysia, we are no stranger to transboundary haze. Hopefully this year we will not experience it, right? And I don't know whether, you know, usually between the months of May to September, we are always looking forward to some kind of haze, yeah, due to burning of forests and also in some plantation concessions in Indonesia and also in Malaysia, yeah. And this is no stranger to us all. And the very basic question is, by looking at all these illustrations that I've given you, is to ask yourself, because we are victims of this, we need to be repatriated, we need to be given reparation or damages because we are the victims of all these pollutions. But what kind of rights are actually given to us in order for us to get some kind of remedy from all these man-made activities? Yeah? Actually, we are the cause of it. And from different sectors and, you know, from different parties, but how do we get some kind of remedy in order to ensure that, you know, whatever harm or suffering that's been done to us is being resolved? Okay, there's some kind of solution, there's some kind of a remedy that can be given to us, yeah, for all the harm and suffering that we've suffered due to all this pollution. So the next question is, the first one is what kind of rights can be given to us? Second one is what kind of reparation or international awards that can be accorded or can be claimed from the violators of pollution? That's another question, yeah? So it goes back to the basic question of our intrinsic right to environmental quality, environmental well-being, our rights to environmental safety and well-being. That's the main question. What is our right? Do we have any rights? Do we have any environmental rights? We know of these human rights, but do we actually been accorded with environmental rights? So then again, the next question would be, if we do have, are we guaranteed of such rights? The so-called environmental rights, yeah? It is a pretty new norm, it's a pretty new term, this environmental rights, and it stems from really international human rights. So international human rights, basically, it's an umbrella, okay? This is a simple explanation to what is human rights, and human rights actually is a branch of the international human rights. So let me just go through with you a little bit on the introduction of what this environmental rights that is linked to human rights law. So we have to understand human rights law first before we can understand what is environmental rights, how it is interwoven or interlinked to international human rights. Right, so when we talk about human rights, we talk about when we talk about environmental rights, we talk about how it is being closely linked with the subject of human rights law. So here, what I've put here is what is environmental rights of man as basic, yeah? So environmental rights means any proclamation of a human right to environmental consideration of a specified quality. That means you as a person must be accorded with some kind of a right to be placed in a safe and secure environment of a certain quality. So that depends again on the domestic legislation in each country. Because Indonesia and Malaysia, for example, would have different standards of quality when it comes to water pollution, when it comes to air pollution, when it comes to how you manage hazardous waste. So we all have different standards and quality. But at the end of the day, the human rights and the environment are actually intertwined. They are together, they're interlinked. You cannot separate them. Without human rights, we cannot have any environmental rights. Let's put it that way, yeah? So human rights cannot be enjoyed without a safe, clean, and healthy environment. What's the point? If you don't have any, a good environment, yeah, a safe environment, you will not be able to enjoy human rights. So sustainable environmental governance cannot exist without the establishment of and respect for human rights. So human rights is actually sacrosanct, yeah? It's a sacred principle under international law by which environmental and management, environmental rights will be accorded with respect to the human rights that we have been accorded thus far. So then again, let's go to the next slide. Are we accorded? The next question is, are we accorded with environmental rights? That's the next question. If you know that human rights are connected to environmental rights, then again, we ask ourselves, are we accorded with environmental rights? In Indonesia, are you accorded with environmental rights? Are you accorded with with good water quality, for example? Are you given that kind of a guarantee? Are you given that kind of right? So in many countries, there are various state obligations regarding human rights and the environment. And the right to a healthy environment has gained constitutional recognition and protection in more than 100 states. Now, when you talk about constitution, you have to look back at the constitution of your country. in Malaysia, we have our own constitution, which is called the Federal Constitution. And I will talk about that later on, yeah, because we're going to move from one state to the other. Examples that I will give in order to show you that whether or not such states have constitutional rights embedded within it, okay? Embedded within it, that you have the right to a healthy environment. We'll just go through it afterwards. Now, about 2/3 of the constitutional rights refer to a healthy environment. Alternative formulation includes rights to a clean, safe, favorable, wholesome, or ecologically balanced environment. Then again, when you talk about this, the interpretation will differ from country to country. US might be a little bit different from the meaning of, for example, a good air quality will be completely different from Malaysia's or Indonesia, because we have our own unique quality as a state. Therefore, we have our own standards as well, right? So it cannot be the same. Next. Okay, if you were to see this map, which I got this from this environmental rule of law report. If you were to see a website on this, you'll be able to see this map, which denotes dark green areas to have countries with the constitutionally protected right to a healthy environment. And the light green countries are considered countries with constitutional provisions for a healthy environment. Now, two distinct categories. One is protected right. The other one is less, less emphasis, is more towards a healthy environment, okay? And Indonesia is in the dark green, right? And you have to tell me later on as to whether or not how your rights are embedded within your constitution, right? So all along this lecture, I want you to stand by and take a look at what Indonesia is currently experiencing when it comes to rights for a healthy environment, okay? Now, when I said earlier on, international human rights law and environmental rights, they are interlinked, right? And under international human rights law, in the treaties itself, it includes right to have clean environment. But funnily enough, there are only human right treaties in the world that actually contains some idea on the environment, on the identifiable right to environment. There are only two. The first one is Article 24, African Charter on Human and People's Rights. A so-called third generation human right entitles a right to environment which should be general, satisfactory, and favorable to development. The next one is the Article 11 of the San Salvador protocol to the ACHR. The next one I think everybody knows is the Principle of Stockholm Declaration, which refers to environmental rights as a life of dignity and well-being. And also under the Rio Convention, where under Principle 10, it formulates the link between human rights and environmental protection, where they actually created these procedural terms, yeah, which you can see in many of the agreements, international environmental agreement. And even at the ASEAN level, you'll be able to see this, but not so much explicit terms, but more of a general term in what kind of methods or approaches that ASEAN countries can take in order to protect the environment at the ASEAN level. So you'll be able to see all these words within many environmental law treaties, when you talk about protection of the environment and so forth. But at the international level, when it comes to the human rights treaties, there are only two thus far. So all this while, the international community, the NGOs, some of the countries have actually worked on how to refine these environmental rights. Yeah, they are trying in many ways of how to specifically state what are these so-called environmental rights. We have human rights, yes, but what are these environmental rights? How do you specify it specifically? So in 2018, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, Professor John Knox, had actually set out the framework principles on human rights and the environment. Yeah, basically, it addresses the basic obligation of states for them to enjoy a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. They would have to kind of follow 16 principles that have been proposed in this framework. Yeah, and Prof. John Knox did say that many of the obligations described by the framework principles and commentary are based directly on treaties or binding decisions from human rights tribunals, while others draw on statements of human rights bodies that have the authority to interpret human rights law, but not necessarily to issue binding decisions. So these framework principles should be accepted as a reflection of actual or emerging international human rights law. In other words, at the end of the day, these so-called framework principles on human rights, on environmental rights, are actually stemming from what they have transpired throughout the years on developing or on questioning or on discussing on the decisions made from these tribunals to come up with some kind of principles, a hardcore really principles on what these environmental rights involved. So I'll just go through the 16 principles, but I want you to reflect again how Indonesia has rightly accorded environmental rights to Indonesians, yeah, in accordance with all these principles. Has Indonesian government complied or applied or all these 16 principles that I will go through with you today? So let's just have a look at the first three of the obligations. So framework principle 1, states should ensure a safe, clean, hang on, yeah. Sorry. Hang on, sorry. Okay. I repeat, yeah. Principle 1, it states that a country should ensure a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in order to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. That's the first principle. Second principle, states should respect, protect, and fulfill human rights in order to ensure a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. When it comes to principle 2, the method should be procedural, yeah? Procedural and also substantial rights that the states must comply with or come up with, yeah? Framework principle 3, states should prohibit discrimination and ensure equal and effective protection against discrimination. This one I feel has largely dealing with, for example, discrimination against indigenous people. Yeah, I'm not so sure how it works in Indonesia, but in Malaysia, there have been some semblance of discrimination against what is known here as orang asal. Some of these orang asal actually lives in, in remote areas in the jungle, and many of the companies have actually encroached into their land. So that has become a problem for the orang asal or indigenous people to carry on with their daily lives. So they are relentlessly, working to avoid all these kind of encroachment by big companies like logging companies, concessionaires, palm oil concessionaires, and some of the other plantation companies. The very reason that they have been impacted by it, creates this question or a notion of discrimination and whether or not Malaysia actually follows this principle 3 is something to be discussed. It's a moot question. Let's carry on with the next principle 4. States should provide a safe and enabling environment in which individuals, groups, and organs of society that work on human rights or environmental issues can operate free from threats, harassment, intimidation, and violence. I understand that in Indonesia itself, you have this NGO called Walhi. Am I right? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and this NGO, and while he is, you know, is well known, it's very active in terms of promoting you know, environmental rights, environmental protection in Indonesia. So, and we have it too in Malaysia. We have MSN, we have CAP, you know, and we have so many others. But the problem is, how far can one go, or how far can a group go in order to put up with, you know, the discrimination and the issues on environmental protection against certain companies or against the government, you know, to what extent? So this can be a problem as well. And you can see there are many other examples like Greenpeace. You know, they have received so many threats, and sometimes they threaten the companies that allegedly to have been polluting in for example in Greenland, or in the Canada, or even in the Gulf of Mexico and so forth. So this is one area that I think many countries will have to work on in terms of accepting this kind of individuals, groups, and organs of society. Yeah. Principle 5 really relates to countries that needs to respect and protect the rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. So this one again actually relates to principle 4. Principle 6 is utterly important, where states should actually provide for education and public awareness on environmental matters. Here again, in Malaysia, let me just impart with you a little bit of experience in Malaysia. We do not have a specific syllabus on environmental education. Yeah, basically some idea of environmental education is being embedded into some you know, some into many subjects, and we don't have a specific one on environmental discussion or environmental issues. So that's one area that Malaysia is looking at. And the other one is public awareness. I think this happens everywhere. Without public education, without educating them and asking them to be aware through whatever methods, through whatever means, through whatever media of communication, I think, you know, environmental issues will be at a disadvantage, because I think we need public to be aware, to be up there, you know, to be up there to understand what is it all about when it comes to protecting their environment. So they need to know all the basic questions. We don't need to teach them, you know, things like on principles of environmental. No, we just ask them to do basic things every day, for example, recycling and so forth. If it's done, if you can form a good habit, by educating them in terms of recycling, for example, then that will be a plus to protect the environment. Now let's carry on with principle 7. States should provide public access to environmental information by collecting and disseminating information and providing affordable, effective, and access to information. Now, principle 7, principle 8, and principle 9, they are actually interconnected. If you were to look at it, it talks about public access to information when a certain activity or certain development is to take place. Now, in Malaysia, we have this environmental impact assessment where any project proponent, any development company who intends to build, let's say, for example, a mall or build a residential apartment, they need to come up with a report, EIA report. And even in that aspect, Malaysian government, the Department of Environment has come under fire because, there is no such thing as public participation, as they say. So it becomes a big problem as to whether the transparency on the part of the government is, considered to be an important factor in ensuring that this environmental information is to take place in Malaysia. So this is an aspect that we all need to look at. So you talk about public participation in Principle 9. You talk about prior assessment of the environmental impacts, and then you talk about how does the public have access to all this environmental information. So this is another area that is currently, I think, many countries are having problems with. How do you include the public into making decisions about certain development that may have environmental impacts or effects on that proposed area. Principle 10, states should provide for access to effective remedies for violation of human rights and domestic laws relating to the environment. Now, when it comes to this, Principle 10, I think when you look at the question of, or the situation, I know it's a very sensitive discussion on transboundary haze. Yeah, it's always Indonesia and Malaysia clashing with each other. Yeah, but at the end of the day, you must look at the remedies afforded to our own people. I think that's most important. I think our own people are actually being victims when it comes to haze pollution. Yeah. And what kind of remedies can be given to them? What kind of remedies can they claim from? Who can they claim from? The government for the lack of action taken, or you can claim remedies from the companies. How do you claim them? Do you have any access to the courts for this? So these are the questions that you need to ask when you talk about access to effective remedies. And the next thing is also, it goes back to the very foundation of education again. Whether or not the people in our countries do understand their rights again, whether they have any rights to gain some kind of remedy for such violations. Do they have any rights? That's the first thing you need to ask. And then whether or not, if they do, then you ask yourself as to whether they have any access to effective remedies. How do I get this? How do I get these remedies? Do I have to make a statement of claim, sue the companies, for example, take them to the courts? And how will the court actually react to this? Now, then again, that's another question. Most of the countries in the world, they do not have any green benches. In Malaysia in itself, when it comes to access to effective remedies, asking the courts to give some kind of remedies for the violations occurred, or the impacts occurred onto certain area or public area or residential area, it is quite a problem, because we still abide by our own legislation, and the jurisprudence, the environmental jurisprudence in Malaysia is rather lacking. I shall talk about that later on. Now, let's move on to Principle 11. Now, Principle 11 states that any country should establish and maintain substantive environmental standards. This one will relate to your legislation. What kind of standards, what kind of values, what kind of minimum standards and values that we talk about? What kind of quality that we're talking about when it comes to, let's say, for example, air quality, water quality in the river, and so forth, yeah? And that these standards should not be discriminatory. You can't have like, one set of standards and values for such companies, for example, or such pollution in that area, for example, and you have another set of standards for another kind of activity or kind of companies that are more or less the same, in the same nature. So you can't have that as well. The other one that you can't have is this retro effect. In Malaysia, I think if you were to read the case of the Bakun Dam, this was the case where the Sarawak government had actually wanted to come up or build a dam in Sarawak, yeah? And due to certain inconsistencies in the laws, they had actually made a certain law into a retrospective law. So you can't have that at all. You've got to look forward to that and build on that environmental standards, not looking back. If you were to look back, it defeats the purpose. So you've got to come up with something more advanced, something which is not discriminatory, and it cannot have this retrospective effect on decisions or in terms of standards as well. Now, Principle 12, again, denotes that states should ensure the effective enforcement of the environmental standards against public and private actors. This is a big issue. In Malaysia, we always talk about enforcement. How do we enforce these standards? We have beautiful legislations, we have beautiful laws in the world, the perfect laws, but how do we actually make it effective? So this is one area which I think most countries or all countries in the world are struggling with, how to ensure sufficient enforcement of the environmental laws, and standards. Now, Principle 13, states should cooperate with each other to establish, maintain, and enforce effective international legal frameworks in order to prevent, reduce, and remedy transboundary and global environmental harm that interferes with the full enjoyment of human rights. This one, I think, let's not go too far. Let's just stick with at the ASEAN level. At the ASEAN level, as you know, we have so many environmental conventions. Sorry? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, right.
Okay.
So let me just continue. We do not need to look far. We just take a look at the ASEAN level. Yeah, as you know, ASEAN has many various environmental treaties when it comes to protecting the environment. And I think the main one that we've been talking about for the last 20 years, or probably, nearly 20 years, is about the Transboundary Haze Pollution Agreement, in 2002. Now, the question is, if you were to look at this Principle 13, it says states should cooperate with each other to establish, maintain, and enforce effective international legal frameworks. Now, when you talk about that Transboundary Haze Agreement, have all states that have signed the agreement reach this cooperation with each other? That's the thing that we need to look at. But then again, it's not as easy as it is. You have to look again at the uniqueness of the country, uniqueness of the relationships amongst themselves. You have to look at the political will. You have got to look at the economic and stage of development in each country. You have to look at the education and the status of the full enjoyment of human rights in that country. So you've got to take everything into context. So it is rather difficult. It's not impossible, but it's quite possible to reach to a certain standard in order to cooperate with each other. Now, people will normally ask, how far can we cooperate with each other? We have our own interests, you have your own interests, how far can we reach a consensus that we can actually effectively, ensure that international legal framework can actually work. Now, Principle 14, it states that countries should take additional measures to protect the rights of those who are most vulnerable to or at particular risk from environmental harm, taking into account their needs, risks, and capacities. Now, these are, when you talk about the most vulnerable, you talk immediately about indigenous people. You talk immediately about flora and fauna. These are the people that basically do not have any, any rights. In other words, they don't have anybody to actually guide them, to take care of them when it comes to protecting their rights. And I think the best example in the world so far is we take a look at the Philippines. I'll talk about the Philippines later on. Now, Framework Principle 15, like I mentioned earlier, states should ensure that they comply with their obligations to indigenous peoples and members of traditional communities. I did mention this earlier. When it comes to encroaching into their lands, yeah, for whatever purposes, for development, for logging activities, you know, for plantation purposes, you know, that we have to recognize that they have their rights to their lands. In Malaysia, in Sarawak and Sabah particularly, and also some areas in Peninsular Malaysia, you know, we have what they call as adat law, or, you know, when it comes to their land. So, but they are not actually being documented. So that's the problem. So you wouldn't know, you know, if let's say, for example, if you're a landowner, you have a grant, a registration grant, saying that this piece of land is actually yours, you know, and the demarcation of the land, the boundary of the land has already been marked in the registration. But unlike the indigenous people, they do not have that. Basically, they are through their adat, and more often it's more of a passing down in terms of hereditary rights, yeah, from one generation to the other. So it's quite difficult in that sense how to complement the development in those areas, and at the same time protecting their traditional rights, yeah, when it comes to indigenous peoples and the traditional communities. So we need to take a look into this very, very, very carefully, and that's why the non-discrimination legislation must come in. Okay. If you're interested, like I mentioned earlier as well, the case on Bakun Dam is one of those cases, is a landmark case actually in Malaysia that talks about constitutional issues, that talks about indigenous people, that talk about public participation in EIA. You can read that, you know, you can read that, and also taking into cognizance of the fact when you talk about constitutional law, you've got to also look at other kinds of methods on how you interpret these rights of environmental development. Now, the other case I like to point out is Tasmanian Dam case. If you were to compare this Tasmanian Dam case to the Bakun Dam, you can see that the decisions that were reached in the courts were completely based on different kind of reasoning. So I'd like you to, you know, if you have some time later on, take a look at these two cases, Tasmanian Dam case and also Bakun Dam in Malaysia. Right, so I'll move on to the final and the last principle, which is principle 16, where states should respect, protect, and fulfill human rights in the actions they take to address environmental challenges and pursue sustainable development. Now, when we talk about sustainable development, you know, we always talk about SDGs, you know, sustainable development goals, etc., etc. You know, what does it mean? You know, we have 17 of them. You know, what does it mean? You know, what does it all mean? How does it apply to Indonesia? How does it apply into Malaysia? What are the, in terms of policies, in terms of legislations, in terms of guidelines, in terms of international agreements that we have to adhere to, or in terms of economic capacity, in terms of, you know, public participation? What are the, in what context you have to take sustainable development into, you know, in what context? So those are the principles that the Prof. John Knox had actually addressed at the council. Now I'd like to move on to the next one, which is the state's position, every country's position on environmental rights. So now you know that we have at the international level, we do have some kind of semblance of environmental rights. You know, there's some framework, there's a framework, and we know what are the principles that the countries will need to adhere to, right? Those are the 16 principles. And now let's look at some countries that have this so-called environmental rights embedded within somewhere in their constitution, somewhere in their laws, somewhere in the legislations, sometimes in the decisions of certain cases, yeah, that talks about and discusses on environmental protection. So let's move on. Are you with me?
Yes, for sure.
Am I too fast?
No.
No, it's okay, Hanim.
It's okay, yeah? Okay.
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 Right. Now, before I carry on with this, I just like you to have a little bit of a reflection. Yeah. In Indonesia itself, you know, taking into the framework principles and the human rights treaties and all that, yeah, how far has Indonesia embraced all these in terms of protecting Indonesia's environmental quality? So think again, so after this, whenever that you're free, you know, think and ponder and reflect on that. Yeah. Okay, let's just move on a little bit with Canada. Now, Canada is one of those countries, if you were to go back to the, remember the green, dark green and the light green map, if you were to see, Canada is not even been, doesn't have any green or the dark green or the light green on its map, yeah, on that area. Now, the reason being because Canada's constitution is completely silent on environmental protection. So where do you embed it, right? So basically, the main constitution, they do not have it, right? So in other words, the right to healthy environment is not accorded within the constitution, but it is recognized in certain provinces and territories in Canada. So there are 5 of them so far that I know. One is Quebec. The other one is Ontario, which has enacted a comprehensive environmental bill of rights in 1993. Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut have modest environmental rights legislation. So they have embedded it somewhere, right? Because they take into account consideration that environment is an important element in order to secure human rights. So they have it, but as a whole, they do not have any kind of succinct or explicit statement within their constitution when it comes to environmental protection in Canada. So next one is, right, this is in your own country. Do you know who this fellow is?
Yes.
Do you know who this fellow is? He's known as Budi Pego, if I'm not mistaken. Do you know this fellow?
No.
Have you seen this man before?
No.
No.
No. Okay, he's
Honestly.
actually a champion in your country when it comes to environmental protection rights. Yeah, because he's a leader, yeah, in one of the environmental groups. Yeah, and he was in prison actually, and I think he was released in 2018. But I think a court case has come up against him again in 2019. So he's a frontliner. Yeah, he's a frontliner in protecting environmental rights in Indonesia. So, but the funny thing was, he was accused of certain crimes against state security. So then again, you refer back to one of the principles in the framework. Remember when I mentioned to you about the NGOs, you know, without any oppression, any threats, and so forth. Now again, some thoughts for you to ponder, yeah, whether or not Indonesia has conformed, or even Malaysia has conformed to all this, yeah, because we too have come up with, petitions and all that. Now, how far are we relevant? How far are these NGOs effective in promoting environmental rights and protection? And but again, in February of 2017, with World Bank support, your Prime Minister Jokowi launched the One Map program to register all land in Indonesia, including disputed areas by 2025. So there are many kinds of initiatives that have been taken in Indonesia when it comes to promoting environmental rights, and I find that very, very inspiring. Yeah, because I think Indonesians are very forthright, and they are brave and bold enough to go beyond the limits. Yeah, the Indonesians are not complacent. In other words, you are brave enough to go beyond, what is status quo, in order to protect your environment. Yeah, in also the equality of the environment. So I applaud that. And Malaysia, I think we are lagging far behind. Yeah, we are quite complacent in that sense. Okay. Next country is the Philippines. Now, I think Dr. Maskun has met many of the champions from the Philippines, Dr. Maskun, in terms of protecting and advocating the protection of environment in the Philippines. So, and this actually comes from the Philippines Constitution that provides for special protection to environmental rights. So, in other words, once this right is provided within a country's constitution, you know, the advocates for these environmental rights have unlimited access to promoting those rights. Now, Philippines is one fine example where in the constitution itself, it says that the state shall protect and advance the right to a balanced and healthful ecology in accord with the rhythm and harmony of nature. Now, these Filipinos, I know them pretty well. They're very passionate. They are empathic, yeah, about securing the protection of the environment. They're very much, they're so into it, and this is also another inspiration for us, for the environmental lawyers and environmental activists. So this Philippine Congress has enacted environmental laws based on the Philippine Constitution that strictly regulates a large portion of the country's economic activity. So in other words, they are balancing between the effects of the economic development as well as ensuring that the environmental protection is adhered to as well. So it's a balance of two natures. So it can be quite difficult. Yeah. Now, the environmental activism of the courts in Philippines, I think, I don't know whether you have heard of this case, Oposa versus Factoran. Dr. Maskun and I have already had the privilege to meet the lawyer, Tony Oposa, yeah, many times, yeah. And this man is such an inspiration, he has gone above and beyond, he's a fantastic, remarkable man, has gone beyond any man, I think, in order to protect the environment in the Philippines. If you have the time also, read into his background. He's quite a man. He's quite a man, And in this case, the Supreme Court of the Philippines held that the above quoted provision in the Constitution, the one that I've mentioned earlier, is not only a statement of policy. It is not just a mere talk, but it is a directly enforceable right. That means you can use that to ensure that the protection of the environment is taken place. So it has that weight, in order to ensure that the government as well as the people can actually do something to protect the environmental protection in the Philippines. So this ruling had actually raised this principle of intergenerational responsibility, which primarily liberalizes the legal standing of petitioners in environmental cases and extends it to minors and persons not yet conceived. In other words, what this case did was, for babies who have not been born yet, for example, right? They are actually, the lawyers actually says that those unborn babies have the right to environmental protection. Is not only those people that are currently existing, but it also extends to babies who have not been born. So you can imagine the extent of the impact of this decision in Oposa. I don't see in any other countries that have taken this kind of direction in terms of coming up with decisions such as these. Philippines is one of the countries that is so far and beyond when it comes to environmental jurisprudence. And I think that's one of the areas, at least for Malaysia, that can actually look into in order to expand on our laws and regulations in accordance with human rights. So take a look at this case. It's a very interesting case. And the next one, which I wish to extend to you, is also in the Philippines. It is a landmark Supreme Court decision where it applies this international law principle on precautionary. I think, Professor, you know about the precautionary, the preventive measures and so forth. But precautionary principle has always been a subject of a moot question. Some countries do not like this principle because it somehow hinders development, you know. Are all of you public international law students? Are you aware of this precautionary principle?
No.
Do you know this precautionary principle?
Yes.
Have you heard of this precautionary principle?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, can I think so. I think if you have studied or you're learning international law, this is one of the principles that will be discussed. Yeah, take a look at this precautionary principle. Yeah, and in this case, it has become a procedural rule. Yeah, in Philippines. That means, in other words, you know, if any cases that were to come up in terms of afraid of the impact of the development, impact of the activity, precautionary principle will take place. Yeah, and in the Philippines, they are so, like I said, they're so well advanced, you know, that they actually apply this international law principle into their domestic cases. So, and it has become a procedure in terms of looking at all the or deciding in an environmental case in Philippines. So take a look at Philippines specifically. Right, India is another one. India is another South Asian country, I suppose the only Asian country, South Asian, yeah, that has a constitution that embeds this rights to environment, a good and safe environment, yeah. So it imposes a duty on the citizen to protect the environment. So then again, compare the constitution in Philippines as well as in India. In Philippines, if I mentioned earlier, you talk about states, yeah. In India, you talk about citizens of the country to protect the environment. So each and every one in India will have to protect the environment. So Article 51-A sub G states the very fact that it shall be a duty of every citizen of India to protect and improve the natural environment, including forests, lakes, rivers, and wildlife, and to have compassion for living creatures. Now, this directive principles under the Indian Constitution is directed towards ideals of building welfare state. Now, healthy environment is also one of the elements of welfare state. Maknanya, basically, you know, you're looking after the well-being of every person in India. So therefore, this fundamental duty of imposing this duty to protect the environment on citizen is eminent, it's prime, it's utterly serious, and everyone in India has the right to a safe and healthy environment. Now in India again, like in the Philippines, there are also advocates when it comes to protecting environmental rights. I don't know whether you have any friends in India, but in India, they have many environmental rights lawyers. Yeah. If you were to look left or right, there'll be one of them, you know, just standing next to you, because they have so many. And they are very active in terms of their NGOs as well. Their activists really up par with the Philippines. And they have come up with cases, yeah, alleging environmental rights that have been violated. Yeah, so these are the two that I've given: the Kulwal versus Rajasthan, and also Subhash Kumar. Now, Kulwal is very simple. You know, when it comes to getting remedies, yeah, for some kind of environmental pollution violation. Normally in Malaysia itself, it used to be, yeah, it used to be that we need to show some kind of harm or suffering or damages done to us. But in this case, and it was in early 1987, yeah, you don't need to prove that you have suffered or you prove to have injuries, right? So this is one of the advancement in the law of environment, that you don't need to show that, you know, you are hurt or you are you know, your cancer is caused by this, and then you don't need to. There's no proof of injury when it comes to alleging that there has been some kind of violation in you know, in certain cases, in environmental case. Now, next is Subhash Kumar versus State of Bihar. This one is to affirm that the right to live is a fundamental right under Article 21 of the Constitution, and it includes the right of enjoyment of pollution-free water and air for full enjoyment of life. So really, basically, what's the point of not having, you know, you need to have a good and healthy environment before you can actually enjoy, you know, your surroundings. So this is basically affirming that. Let's just move on a little bit on the role of courts. I did mention earlier, when it comes to the role of courts in ensuring clean environment, you know, many countries in the world do not have this. They are not progressive enough, right? In Malaysia, we have tried that, you know, and we don't have, for example, a specific court to address cases on environmental violations. We don't have that. But in India, they actually have that. In Australia, they have that. In the Philippines, they have that. But we don't have it in Malaysia. I don't know about in Indonesia. Do you have that kind of, you know, the green courts or green benches, they call it, as in Indonesia? Do you have that? A specified court to try violation, you know, of pollution or environmental pollution? Do you have that?
Not really, actually.
You
Not
don't
really,
have,
actually, Hanim.
oh, you don't have it, yeah, Maskun, yeah?
Yeah, I don't have, yes.
Because I think this is one of the areas I think, you know, Indonesia and Malaysia will have to look at. So we have specified courts in order to address cases pertaining to environmental violations. You know? We don't have this year, and
Yeah,
I think,
Indonesia
yeah.
also, even some
Sorry?
judges actually has been trained for environmental law, but we don't have any court especially to, you know, for
Yeah,
these
yeah,
environmental
yeah,
cases. Yeah.
yeah. It's a pity, actually.
They
It's a
just
pity.
go to they just go to district court
Oh,
still.
yeah, district court.
Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah.
Even with us, at the lower courts, you know, magistrates and sessions. After that, it's just, there's nothing much really, you know, that they talk about when it comes to environmental jurisprudence or, you know, advancement of development of environmental law in Malaysia. Nothing, you know. So
Yeah, exactly.
you always have to look outside of Malaysia, you know. That's a problem lah, what to do. But we'll keep at it lah. We need to have
Yeah.
environmental lecturers like yourself, Maskun, you know, to keep at
Yeah.
this, you know. So anyway, back to this Article 21. Okay, in the Federal Constitution becomes actually a legal basis to claim environmental rights. So its application has been widened by the Indian jurisprudence in environmental law during so many years. Yeah, so the courts always tries to give importance to the aspect of sustainable development through its judgments. So in India, courts is important, right, in order to extend the knowledge of environmental law through their judgments. So court is an active actor in developing environmental law in India. So that's really, really, really inspiring, you know. I find that very, you know, and the thing is, the knowledge is, you know, the knowledge is churning all the time. It's moving, you know, your thoughts process is moving all the time, you know, according to the situation at hand. So the jurisdiction Supreme Court in India has actually widened to include the right of the right to a wholesome environment into Article 21. So when you go to India, you know, you have no problems when it comes to getting friends who are actually environmental lawyers. Yeah, so it's a good way of expanding your knowledge on this. So that is on India. Now, let's move on a little bit. Yeah, we know now that some countries do have constitutions that have already embedded the importance or embedded the policy or embedded the law or embedded these responsibilities to take care of the environment on the state government or the public at large, right? Now, basically, when you look back, yeah, what would be the advantage of having all this? Now, if you were to see from the examples that I've given you, you know, these constitutional environmental rights and responsibilities become this triggering rock or catalyst, yeah, for stronger environmental laws, for better enforcement of those laws, and enhanced public participation. Now, for those that do not have, you know, will, like in Canada, right? So it is not a collective effort, right? It is not a consensus amongst the governing nation, yeah, in order to ensure that, hey, look, environment is number one, right? So with the constitutional environmental rights embedded within the constitution, we can do this, and this. What are the benefits of this? Obviously, at the end of it all, you know, the protection of environmental rights is enhanced, right? And everybody will enjoy the outcome of having you know, a good environmental protection provisions within the laws and regulations, and also in other methods as well, that is somehow a reflection of the constitutional environmental rights. Yeah, but like in Malaysia, we do not have it. Yeah, and that's why we are poorer for it. And due to that, with having this environmental rights in constitution, many of these nations have smaller ecological footprints and have reduced air pollution up to 10 times faster. Now, do you agree with me when it comes to this statement? You think about it, yeah, the last statement. Do you agree with me that those with green constitutions have smaller ecological footprints and they don't pollute as much as those nations without environmental provisions in their constitutions? Have a thought, have a think, yeah. I'd like to hear your response after my lecture. Okay, so those are the benefits, yeah, obviously. Now, next question is, when you have environmental rights, what are environmental rights? What are they composed of? What are embedded with those environmental rights? So there are actually two. The first one is substantive rights. These are the fundamental rights. Second one is procedural rights, the tools or mechanisms or measures used to achieve those substantive rights. Let's just move on a little bit as to what are these substantive rights. Now, substantive rights are those in which the environment has a direct effect on the existence or the enjoyment of the right itself. Now, when you read that, obviously, you know, you'll be at loggerheads with one another thinking, well, what do you mean by this? But to put it into a simpler form, substantive rights comprise of civil and political rights that has a direct effect on us. You know, if you don't have, for example, the rights to life, right? The moment you are born, you are killed. You know, these are substantive rights where what happens to those rights directly affected us. That would be considered as substantive rights. Now, substantive rights, amongst others, are freedom of association, freedom from discrimination, economic and social rights, rights to health, to food, adequate standard of living, cultural rights, rights to access religious sites, collective rights affected by environmental degradation, such as the rights of indigenous peoples. So these are substantive rights, some form of substantive rights. Let's move on to procedural rights, yeah? Now, this is the formal steps to be taken. It is prescribed. It is written in your legislation, for example, right? These are the ways, these are the methods that you need to come up with in order to realize, to make sure that those substantive rights are realized. How? Through all this. Procedural rights include rights to access information, participation in decision-making, and access to justice. For example, like I mentioned earlier, when it comes to procedural rights, public participation, you talk about in Malaysia, we talk about extending that right to public in order for them to make to participate in decision-making process when it comes to a development that is occurring next to their, for example, next to their residential area. Okay, so what are the ways and methods? Then you have to refer to a piece of document, and that piece of document would be your legislation, your laws, your regulation pertaining to, for example, in Malaysia's case, environmental impact assessment. So what are the methods? How are we going to carry this out? What are the steps? What do you mean by public participation? How many people are considered as public participation? How many people you need to have this public participation? What do they need to be informed? How will the information be accessed, and etc. etc. Yeah. So these are the two rights that are considered to be the two categories under environmental rights. Okay, now I'm just going through a little bit on Malaysia's environmental practices. Yeah, like I mentioned before, Malaysia does not have any provision that that specifically states Malaysians have rights to a good environment or a safe environment. Yeah. At the moment, we only have our own federal constitution, which contains the most fundamental of rights, such as the right to life and liberty, equality before the law and equal protection of the law, freedom of movement, freedom of speech and assembly and association, freedom of religion, the right to education and possession of property. Now, if you were to see, nothing is mentioned about environmental right? Environmental protection in the constitution, but in Malaysia's federal constitution, we have lists. We call them the federal lists, state lists, and concurrent lists. Now, all these lists, I don't know whether you can see this, there are different components under this list. It's not so clear, yeah, I'm so sorry. But if you were to see in the circles, there are two circles here. The first circle is the federal list, where the federal government will carry out the responsibilities under those lists. Yeah. Next one is under state list. What kind of matters will the state cover? For instance, when it comes to question on forest, when it comes on the question of land, when it comes on the question of water, for example. So the state government will have to take action on those matters. Now, but there's nothing that's listed somewhere. The environment is under the federal list or the state list. It doesn't say anything about the environment as a term. So whatever it is, let's say, for example, when you talk about mining, or when you talk about port authority or port safety, that has a lot to do with water, and land, it will not come under the state list. It will come under the concurrent list. So basically, what I'm trying to suggest is environment does not appear in any one of those lists, because environment as a term on its own, it covers many, many aspects of the human surrounding, of the human environment. So whatever activities that is taken place, whatever activities can fall within either the federal list, the concurrent list, or the state list. So if you have the time, look into our federal constitution and see identify what kind of matters that come under federal list, concurrent list, and state list. And mind you, some of the activities have a lot to do with environmental impact consequences. So where does it come under? So it depends again. So when you talk about forestry, when you talk about land, for example, logging, yeah, the federal government will not take any action against those logging companies that have violated logging permits, for example, because when you talk about logging, you're talking about forests and land that are owned by the state government. So therefore, the state government has the powers to enforce whatever local laws that they have, or the state laws, onto those violators of logging activities. Federalists will not have any say whatsoever. Now, this issue of overlapping of jurisdictions, yeah, have caused many problems, confusions, yeah, amongst the legislators as well as these two governments. What more, the academics, yeah. At the end of the day, the federal government and the state government have come to terms to work with each other, to cooperate with each other when it comes to those matters that somehow overlaps with both of these jurisdictions. So there could be, there could be some kind of commotion or some kind of dissatisfaction, really, especially amongst the NGOs in Malaysia, because NGOs in Malaysia, there's some of them, especially in Penang. If those of you have been to Penang, there are two very active NGOs, CAP and SAM, and these are the NGOs that have actually been at the forefront to protect the environment. And they've always come up with issues against the Penang state government, especially when it comes to building apartments at the hillsides, yeah? Because when you build hills at the hillsides, it may cause some land erosion, landslides and all that. So they have been alleging that the state government in Penang has not taken any kind of measures to ensure actual and specific protection against these developments on hillsides. So if you have some time, take a look also at the experiences by the NGOs, non-governmental organizations in Penang, okay? They're very, again, committed to the cause. Okay. Do you have any questions in between? Sorry, I'm just going on and on and on. Do you have any questions in between?
Yes, I have questions.
Yes. Yes. No, I can't see you.
I do have questions.
Yes, yes. Yes, Alif, is it? Is it Alif?
To in context of human rights.
Sorry, I can't hear you. Hello?
Hello.
Hello, I can't hear you. Hello?
Hello.
What's the question again? If you can't, because I can't hear you, is it possible after this, right? If we have like, if you want to send me any questions, we can have either you email me. Maskun, can you assist with this, please?
Yes, of course. Just
Yeah.
write it down in chat.
Yeah, you write it down and then can you just send it to me?
Yes, I will.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Any questions from the students, please? Okay.
Okay, just carry on, Hanim. And
Okay,
then,
all right, okay. Now, like I said, in Malaysia, we do not have any kind of embedded provisions within the federal constitution to a right to a healthy environment. So what we have had so far is actually sporadic cases, very far and few between, yeah, about this so-called right to a healthy environment. It's a sad case, but that's what it is in Malaysia. You know, we are quite happy with the way we are. You know, we are not as confrontational as some of the other members in the ASEAN nations. Yeah, be that Indonesia and the Philippines. Yeah, you guys have really strong, activists, environmental activists, and I think Malaysia has a lot to learn from that. So anyway, the landmark case that speaks of this, even that it does not speak, it's not even a speak, it's like a small little by the way remark on this question of guaranteeing, environmental protection. In this case called Tan Teck Seng versus Suruhanjaya Perkhidmatan Pendidikan, which was in 1996. And the judge then was Datuk Sri Gopal Sri Ram, where in this case, it stated that the right to live in a reasonably healthy and pollution-free environment is implicit in Article 5 of the Federal Constitution, which guarantees the right to life. In other words, what he meant was really, the judge said, the expression life appearing in Article 5 of our Federal Constitution does not refer to mere existence. It incorporates all those facets that are an integral part of life itself and those matters which go to form the quality of life. So of these are right to seek and be engaged in lawful and gainful employment and to receive those benefits that our society has to offer to its members. Then he says, it includes the right to live in a reasonably healthy and pollution-free environment. And in bracket, he actually wrote that. The emphasis is mine. So that was in 1996, yeah? And after that, there was nothing. There was no indication as to, what you mean by this so-called a right to a healthy environment and so forth. There's another case which is speaks of this, but really it talks about is an indirect discussion on this right to a healthy environment. And this case is known as Adong bin Kuau, yeah, in 1998. This one really does not have any, how do you say, I wouldn't say it's a direct statement on the safety or the rights to a healthy environment. It was just an indirect way of saying, hey, look, we have this problem and it has a direct implication on environment because of this such activity. So therefore, when you have the right to property, you must ensure you take care of that property in terms of making sure that it's pollution free. That was it. There wasn't really like a hard rule like in the federal constitution and any other decisions made in India, for example, to say that, hey, look, we have this right. We have this right for a healthy environment. In Malaysia, sadly, we don't. Yeah. So Malaysia is a way of, behind than the rest. So in other words, in Malaysia, the question goes, is there such a thing as environmental rights? Yeah. Is there such a thing? For me, there's none. It's all pretty much indirectly, indirectly expressed, yeah, in various activities, in various decisions, but even decisions in judgments, as you can see, probably less than 5. So we are not really, the Malaysians are not really successful advocates in terms of environmental law protection, yeah. But in 1992, earlier than that, yeah, the Environmental Law Review Committee also made a recommendation to amend the constitution and spell out the right of individuals to have a healthy and clean environment. Up until now, up until we have the environmental policy, Malaysian environmental policy, we still do not have any changes made in the constitution. Yeah. Later on in 1996, environmental protection issue again was raised in the National Conference State of the Environment. And that was timely because during 1992, it was only a few years after that this conference took place, after the Rio conference, that they were talking about giving this or according this rights of environment of a clean environment to the people in Malaysia. Then it went all quiet. Yeah, only in 2012, this is that the Malaysian judiciary, the Supreme Court, the chief judge has mentioned that there must be some kind of a direct intervention by the courts to ensure that the environment is kept clean by looking at all these environmental law cases, yeah, and expanding again the realm of the environmental jurisprudence in Malaysia. So that again is another a foot forward, as you can put it, a foot forward in Malaysians' experience in developing environmental law. And then obviously after that, we had this so-called green bench, where all the judges apparently in the lower courts will have to work within a certain courts to try and make decisions on basically its procedural cases. They just refer to legislations, they just come up with penalties, and that's about it. They never actually deliberated on principles of environmental law. So the thing has not been expanded in Malaysia. So that's very unlikely in Philippines and India, yeah, where they have really gone beyond. They have broke certain, how do you say this, expressions of environmental law, or fundamental liberties, in order to move ahead with the times. So Malaysia is actually way behind, really. We're still stuck with, legislations and rules and just go and penalize and that's about it. We are not standing it further than that, So other examples of environmental rights in Malaysia's environmental protection practices. Basically, we have, but in all the sporadic legislations and very sectoral in manner, where the ordinary citizens, they actually participate in decisions affecting the environment. And where do we get that? Basically in the planning laws and in reviews of projects when it comes to environmental impact assessments. And you can find that under Section 34A of our own Environmental Quality Act 1974. Now, this Environmental Quality Act 1974 currently is under review. So we are coming up with a new Environmental Protection Act. I do not know when, we've been called in to talk about some review amendments, on certain provisions, but the government has not come up with an actual draft on it yet. So we are still waiting. But hopefully within that ambit of the new act, they would include more principles under international law, like precautionary method, preventive method, and so forth. So hopefully it is somehow it has some kind of making a pathway into our own local legislation. The other one that we talk about of the citizens participation in Malaysia is in Town and Country Planning Act 1970. This is all an old act. Yeah, we do not have any, comprehensive act that takes in every aspect of the environmental pollution, every aspect of activities, and put them all under one umbrella. We do not have that. We are pretty much, in terms of preventing pollution, pretty much sectorial in manner. So it has become a problem again because some of the acts are basically governed by the state and some acts are governed by the federal government. So here again, you see there is this merging of, or rather overlapping of jurisdictions in trying to govern environmental legislations in Malaysia. So that's one of the biggest problems we have in Malaysia, yeah? Okay, but this is just one of those remarks that I want to put forth as to why we need to have, advancement in terms of environmental law jurisprudence. How do we expand it? Because we know that due to economy, activities, and so forth, there will be great impact on the environment. How can we, secure it or minimize those impacts? Yeah, because if we were to carry on and on and on and on, obviously it will impinge on the environment. The consequences to the environment will be great, will be severe. How do we balance it all up? Needless to say, yeah, even if you don't have a very, how do you say, a very active, as compared to India and Philippines when it comes to NGOs, we have this, what is known as a center which upholds the human rights, yeah, in Malaysia, and it is known as Suhakam. I don't know whether many of you have heard of this. Suhakam, or known as the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, by which the functions of them are these, okay? So this would be in relation to human rights. Now, but the Suhakam itself does not, somehow, they do not concentrate on environmental protection. They somehow work around the realm of, women and children's protection. They talk about illegal migrants. They talk about drug trafficking, human trafficking and all that. So, but when it comes to environmental human rights, they have not really raised that issue thus far. Okay, this is, I think, this is my last slide, yeah? And this will have a very strong emphasis on how we are supposed to ensure that, I'm taking this in the light of transboundary case, yeah? How Malaysia can move on from what we have now, yeah? And we see that in Malaysia, the main problems, apart from water pollution, apart from local air pollution, the main one is, when it affects other countries, is basically haze, yeah? And of course, there's some areas in Straits of Malacca when we talk about marine pollution caused by oil spill, yeah, for example, yeah. This notion that I'm putting forth in front of you, it's on the responsibilities of companies to ensure that they have complied to some kind of environmental considerations and impacts. Basically on those activities that they are carrying on in their own country or in other people's country. Now, I'm linking this to harm caused by haze in Malaysia. And I'm sure it's the same thing as in Indonesia, yeah? Correct me if I'm wrong, in Indonesia, I don't think there has been any kind of movement or approach in, how do you say this, in addressing remedies against Malaysian companies that have caused haze in Indonesia, yeah? I do not know of that, yeah? All I know that you have taken steps to make redress on those domestic companies, or on those domestic companies that have linked with the Malaysian companies to be judged at your courts, yeah? Now, when it comes to this is one of the big areas that we need to look at, I believe, yeah? We talk about the responsibility of companies towards human rights, because more often than not, you were to find that companies are the ones that pollute, yeah? When you talk about haze, we talk about the palm oil plantation companies, yeah? And in Malaysia, we have two acts that we press on the companies that pollute. The first one, again, is our Environmental Quality Act 1974, and the other one is Companies Act 2016. But at the very end, yeah, again, it goes back to the sufficiency of enforcing these acts on the environment, yeah, in order to secure environmental rights. So far as I've researched, the EQA 1974 is somehow somewhat lacking in certain ways in order to address this issue of transboundary haze pollution. We have tried, I think professors have tried, have already assessed, yeah, how to get redress from other countries that have caused this haze pollution. Now, if under international law, there are various approaches, but when it comes to environmental pollution caused by haze, caused by activities in other countries, yeah, business activities in other countries, there are three-pronged approaches that I believe in order to protect the environmental rights, yeah. More often than not, we see, even in Malaysia, when we look at EQA 1974 to protect the environment in Malaysia, we always bank on penal measures, meaning we either fine them, we either jail them, or we either sebat them, right? Whip them, right? Now, that is when things have already occurred. Now, I believe that when it comes to preventing harm caused by environmental pollution, yeah, and securing human rights again, yeah, to enjoy environmental well-being, these three-pronged approaches I have put up here, the precautionary and preventive and penal measures, are to be taken together. Yeah, there's no point to me pinning on the companies, yeah, for penal measures. There's no point alone without looking at the precautionary and preventive measures. Maknanya, you have, before even the development takes into place, the companies must take certain actions to ensure that some precautionary measures have been put in place. In other words, even before, way before they have actually, they're actually running the activity, they've already assessed, scrutinized the activity, and see what kind of preventive mechanisms or precautionary mechanisms that can be put in place in order to protect the environment from that so-called activity. That's very, very important. There's no point having a legislation to protect the so-called human environment by just pinning down on them via whipping, fine, and imprisonment. It will not be as effective. Because at the end of the day, in order to secure in order to secure environmental rights, you must start from the word go, not when it has already happened. It must start from the word go, from A. When it already happens, it is rather too late. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that every one of us, every one of us must ensure that in order to protect our own environment from any kind of pollution, it must start from the word go. You can't afford to wait when something has already happened, right? And it's difficult to turn back the clock. And only at that time want to take some kind of action. That would be futile because the harm has already occurred. So you would have to ensure that something must be done right now, even before that activity is to take place, probably in 3 years' time or 4 years' time. But you've already seen the repercussions, the consequences of that development on the environment. And that's how I think all of us must secure our human rights when it comes to environmental protection. And the other way is, in Malaysia at least, when you're asking for certain remedies, I've already mentioned this earlier, you need this locus standi. Locus standi means whether or not you have any kind of a standing in terms of taking an action against the other country, the other companies that have caused pollution, or the other countries that have caused pollution in your country, right? Now, as I mentioned before, locus standi needs some kind of a harm. You must prove that that they have caused you some harm, some suffering. You may have lost your eyesight due to some kind of a pollution, a chemical pollution. You have to show that you've been affected by that particular pollution. Now, in Malaysia, we have moved ourselves from that we have gone beyond that. Now, in Malaysia, in order for us to take an allegation against anybody who has caused some kind of pollution, alleged pollution, we don't need to show any harm. We can always put forth that we have genuine interest in that kind of situation. We just have to show that we have an interest in that case. As long as we have interest in that case, we can take an action against the company. It used to be you need to show some kind of proof that you are suffering, that you're in hospital, that you're undergoing medication and all that. But now in Malaysia, there is no more. It's good enough, it's sufficient if you can show that you have sufficient interest, genuine interest. Like orang asal, for example, the one that I mentioned earlier, where they find that their land has been encroached. They don't need to show that they have, their survival has been somehow compromised. They don't need to show that. As long as they have genuine interest, in that sense, they have interest in the land, is good enough for them to take an action against the companies. So take a look at this United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. that was formed, I think, in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, yeah, and see how do you say this direction or the approaches the companies will have to take in order to conform with these human rights, including some principles of the human rights that can be used in order to secure the environmental protection and quality in anyone's country. And I think this is my last slide. Yeah, I think I've spoken too much. I just want to ask, this is my last slide. I just want to ask some kind of reflection on your side. What would be your response to environmental rights in your country? Because I did mention earlier, I'd like to hear your feedback on your position, on your situation in Indonesia, as to how this environmental rights have taken place. Can anybody give me some kind of an idea? Because I like to learn as well, you know. Okay, Mas Kun?
Okay. Hanim, I also sent you some question of the participants in your WhatsApp.
In my WhatsApp, okay.
Yes, yes.
Right.
There are around 5 questions actually.
Okay, hang on, yeah. Okay, question 1. Bagaimana strategi? I'm just going to answer some, yeah. I'm not going to answer all, yeah. I can revert with a written answer, but I'm just going to take some which I find. Okay, this one is very interesting. I don't know who asked this. In relation to state duty, given the context that we are facing highly severe environmental problems, do you think it is justifiable if state is using I can't even pronounce this, authoritarian approach to face environmental problem? Who asked this question?
Hans, yeah.
Who asked? Mas Kun, yeah?
No, me. I don't want to. Wait a minute.
Who asked this question?
Hans.
In relation to state
I
duty.
answer the question.
Hans, would you like to hands up,
Oh,
please?
Hans. Okay, Hans Joshua.
Yeah.
Hello, apa khabar? I hope you've learned something from my presentation, yeah? Within this 1 hour and 45 minutes. Okay, let me just answer this question. In relation to state duty, given the context that we are facing highly severe environmental problems, do you think it is justifiable if state is using authoritarian approach to face environmental problem? Oh, wow. That's a huge question, yeah? Because when you talk about authoritarian, you talk about, you know, having a government specifying or giving real orders, yeah, commands really, to say that, hey, no, you have to do this, you have to do this, and you have to do this, yeah, as far as I know. Now, wouldn't this go against the very grain of human rights protection, of environmental rights protection? You as a person would want to have already secured some kind of human rights within your constitution, for example, yeah? Now, once you have this authoritarian approach, it would be in contradiction with your freedom of liberties, your freedom of life, your freedom of expression, and so forth. Now, when you have authoritarian authorities, as though that you are supposedly to have to do this accordingly to the authorities of state government and federal government. Would that be fair? Now I ask you, Balik Hans, would that be taking into consideration human rights and environmental rights, be a sacrifice on those rights in itself?
Okay.
Now that's a very interesting question. Kalau di Malaysia, we call it macam kuku besi kan? We call it regime kuku besi. Yeah? Where the authority states everything and everything else. It's like it's very close to a social welfare in a socialist system in China. China is more of a capitalist social system now. You know, no more socialist system. No more, but again, my question is, if you were to do this kind of approach, would it go against the grain of environmental rights or human rights in the least?
Yeah, obviously. That's why I'm concerned about these issues of authoritarian environmentalisms, because there are several there are several scholars saying that maybe we should, let's say, change our approach to authoritarian environmentalism. But I think the trade-off would be, if, for example, we are applying this approach, the authoritarian environmentalism, meaning that there will be severe limitations, especially towards the civil and political rights of the citizens, right? But
Yes.
in best scenario, they are saying that in their best scenario, maybe there is a slight possibility that we can change the behavior of the individuals, the behavior of the people. So that is why they are, let's say, offering this kind of authoritarian environmentalism. But I think there will be trade-off of human rights happens if we are applying this kind of approach. That is why I am asking you, do you think is it
Exactly.
justifiable only under the context of severe environmental problems, only under this particular context? Do you think is it justifiable to use?
Right. Let me just illustrate to you an example. Yeah, in Singapore, yeah, a long time ago, yeah, they had this law where you're not supposed to chew any gum.
Yeah.
Chewing gum, right?
Yes.
Right?
We are aware of.
Yes. And that is considered as, I think, on Singapore's government's part, trying to ensure that they create some kind of a healthy habit in not to litter. Yeah, that is part of the, but Singapore does not have any kind of embedded constitution when it comes to healthy environment. So they did it within this so-called authoritarian, not in severe circumstances, yeah? They don't have any severe environmental problems, but it's just to create habits. Now, if the intention is to create habits, to me, it's totally fine. But because at the long end, again, Hans, you need education and awareness. Now, if you want to impose on someone severe problems like severe problem, Indonesia, what's the most severe problem? In Makassar, Indonesia, Makassar. What do you feel like?
We have environmental problems. We have problems on littering. We have problems on, mostly, I think, mostly environmental problems.
Yeah, when it comes to, is it severe enough to impose authoritarian approach?
No. In the context of Makassar, I don't think so, because like it wouldn't be effective anyway, seeing the behavior of the people.
Okay. Okay. So you're trying to say Makassar people are not in here?
Yeah, I think if we are, for example, applying authoritarian approach in Makassar, it will be counterproductive.
Oh, it would be.
Yeah,
but if you were to impose, when you say authoritarian, if you were to impose with severe penalties, would that be a problem? When you talk about authoritarian, you must put penalties in line as well. Now, you have, you know what I mean? So if you're littering, let's say if you're littering, Hans, and I impose on you, hey, look, you are littering, you are supposed to go to jail, authoritarian, I'm putting you to jail now. Do you think that work in a long period of time? Will that be effective enough?
In a long period of time to give the deterrent effect towards the people, I think, it would work. There's a possibility that it will work.
Right. Now, the next question I ask you is, wouldn't that go against the liberties? Your liberty as a human being.
Yeah.
You get me now? So it's like, I don't have any answer to this. I'm just giving you more questions to discuss. Right?
Because that's what I'm aware of.
Yeah. Because it opens up
if we are applying authoritarian approach, then our civil liberties will be severely limited. And I think in this kind of conditions, we have to see, like which one should be the main concern, the civil liberties or the environmental problems. So like we have to put, our main concern, which one we have to choose, because we cannot cherry pick and take both of them.
Yeah, because actually, to tell you honestly, everything is done in a balance. At least we try to. Sometimes, we talk more about environmental protection while we don't take too much the other considerations like economic activities. development, other development projects and so forth. So we care more about the environment. But some cases, it's more like this. We don't care too much about the environment, but we care a lot about the economic activity to transcend the country into another development stage. So it's very difficult, if you say authoritarian, what is the outcome, or what is the underlying result that you want to get really from this? So every country in the world is experiencing this. Sometimes environmental protection in certain cases, when you talk about transboundary haze, Prof. Juaje, right? Malaysians would say, hey, we are very concerned about our environmental health. So therefore we need to get some kind of reparation from Indonesia. For example, I'm not trying to fight with you, but this is one of the examples, right? And at the same time, in our own country, we are actually struggling to ensure that balance is taking place within our own country. So it is like, there is no answer to this, Hans. Is more on the intention of the government at that current situation, right? And the education and awareness of the people or the population in those countries. So I can't give you whether it's a good way or it's I don't have any real answers to that. It really depends on the country. At the end of it, what kind of outcome would they wish to get from that authoritarian approach? Tapi on one hand, you can even do it in your home. If you're married, right, and you have children, who's the authority in your home? Your household will be the father, right? Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. So you have to gauge, you have to balance it all out. So sometimes you may need to be an authority, sometimes you may need to be somebody who is much more kinder, right? It depends. Okay, thank you for that question. I'll take another question. Okay. Okay. Okay, I take the last one. What about the rule of law regarding imported waste in Malaysia? Are there criminal sanctions? Who asked this question?
Rudy.
Siapa?
Rudy Hanim.
Budi, where are you, Budi? What about the rule of law regarding imported waste in Malaysia? This is a tough one. Okay, because as you know, in Malaysia we are experiencing a lot of imported waste from Australia, plastic waste, from Japan, from Australia, they keep on importing waste in whatever kind of way into our country. Are there, well, when it comes to imported waste, we do have our import and export rules and procedure, and apparently we can only import, because when it comes to waste, there are certain categories that we have in our laws, and we can only import certain kinds of waste, certain categories of waste, not all. Now, when it comes to this imported waste in Malaysia, again, there are illegal waste and there are legal waste. Okay, there are illegal and legal waste. So we are taking everything in. Malaysia is taking everything in. And now, whether or not there are criminal sanctions, it really depends on the immigration, the customs laws. If you were to find there is any kind of illegal importation of waste into Malaysia, obviously we have certain laws on that. We are taking action against those violators. But normally it's very difficult. Because they'll come back to Malaysia. No, they'll come into Malaysia with false documentation. So it's very difficult to trace them back to the actual violators. So when they have those documents, they are actually either fake, or they put in some kind of misinformation that becomes very difficult for us to detect, to identify. So that has become a weakness in the enforcement of imported waste in Malaysia. Of course, there are criminal sanctions because it's a criminal act. So that's my answer to that question. I'll take in one. I like your questions, lah. I'll get back to you on this. Samuel, I like your questions. Oh dear, when and how can we complain regulations our country can no longer? Okay, this one really, this is a second question which I've received. If we find violations of environmental rights funded by the World Bank, for example, the Mandalika Circuit Development Project or Reclamation Project, and that's one of your projects in Makassar? Mandalika Circuit?
In Lombok.
In Lombok. Or Reclamation Project, where and how can we complain if regulations in our country can no longer accommodate environmental rights? This suggests to me that in Indonesia, am I safe to say that some of the environmental rights in Indonesia has not been accommodated with?
Fadli, hello Fadli.
Are you suggesting that?
Fadli.
Prof. Juaje, what do you think about this? I think one of your students is saying that your environmental rights in Indonesia is not being fulfilled, it has not been protected. How do you, what is the situation in Indonesia when it comes to this? Prof. Juaje. Any response to this, Prof? Your student's trying to find out where she can complain or he can complain if regulations in your country can no longer accommodate environmental rights. What's the situation really in Indonesia? Can anyone give me some kind of...
Maksudnya apabila terjadi pelanggaran hak asasi manusia dalam hal penggusuran dan penggunaan hak, di mana dapat komplain itu, Pak?
I think Prof. Juaje, I think you're the best person to answer this question. Do you know the International Human Rights Commission? Fadli?
Yes.
But do you have anything in Indonesia that kind of institute this kind of proceedings against those violators of environmental rights? Do you have it in Indonesia? Some kind of I don't know, arbitration or you know, some adjudication centers when it comes to this?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
Now, adjudication arbitration center tak ada ya?
Now we have arbitration center actually, but cases related to the this question actually no, Hanim.
Oh, none, yeah. So when it comes to environmental rights, tak ada lah.
Yeah.
Tak ada, none, yeah. Okay. Now, as much as you're worried where and how, I'm also worried how and when, because the thing is, when it comes to environmental rights in Malaysia, I'm talking about Malaysia, we are not really active in terms of pushing ahead the agenda on environmental rights. So therefore, we always keep it in the background. We never talk about this environmental protection, even if we know that that we have been violating or people have been violating our environmental rights. We have not come up to this stage yet, yeah, but I feel that at the end of the day, you would have to go to the International Commission of Human Rights, if at all, if you have a claim, if you have a rightful claim, yeah, at the end of the day, yeah. Okay, most of the, well, I have a few more. What I'll do is I'll write the answer or response to those answers, and I'll revert that to Dr. Maskun. Can I do that?
Yes, of course, sure.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else you like to ask me before? Dah 2 jam dah kan, Maskun? 11 o'clock already, Maskun. I've got another meeting 11:30.
Okay.
You know?
Okay.
Okay.
And
So, I hope that all of you have somehow taken away some, you know, a little bit of my 2 cents worth on what environmental rights in relation to the overarching principle under human rights. And I hope that if there are any questions or any kind of a feedback, you know, can always get in touch with me or through Dr. Maskun or through FND. Yeah. Do you have classes after this? And thank you very much for listening to me. I know I've been talking on and on and on for the last
berapa?
1 hour and more than 1 hour, ya. Ya, semuanya
Yeah.
puasa ya. So
Terima
a
kasih
little bit
banyak.
tiring on my part
Yeah,
as well,
bro.
ya. Yeah. But thank
Okay,
you
bro.
so much for listening. You know, I hope that I've expanded a little bit on your understanding on environmental human rights, yeah. Okay.
Okay, bro.
A little bit on perspective on Malaysia's environmental human rights. So thank you very much, everybody.
Terima
Thank you
kasih
very
Thank you
banyak.
very much for listening to. Thank you, Prof. Joajir.
Terima
You
kasih.
still
Prof.
haven't answered your students' question. You have to answer your students' question after this, okay? Thank you so much. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you,
Okay,
bro.
Mas Kun. Terima kasih banyak-banyak ya.
Ya.
Yeah,
Selamat
bro.
berpuasa, selamat berbuka ya. Thank
Masih
you
lama
so much. Thanks,
berbuka.
Mas Kun.
Oke.
Okay, salam to Prof. Farida.
Ya, siap. Salamnya juga Ibu Dekan.
Okay, thank you
Yes,
very
welcome.
much. Thank you, everybody.
Oke,
Thank you.
Thank you, bro. Have a
Anything
nice
you
day.
just get in touch with Dr. Mas Kun, ya. If you have any questions. Vira, Prof. Joajir, Rudy, No Effendi, Romelto, Hans, Ali, Christoph, Pascalis, Asram, Yusran, Wahyudi, Fadli, Iqbal. Wow, so many of you. Have I
No.
met you before? Have I met them before, Mas Kun?
Pardon?
Did they come to the conference last year?
Yes, they did. They did. Of course.
Oh,
They
you
can-
did, yeah? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And I
Because-
hope that you know you continue. Hopefully that you become an environmental activist in your own country. But don't get into trouble, okay? Do not get into trouble, right? But
Yeah.
you know, make sure that the you know you take care of your environment. It's utterly important, yeah. And take care of
Yes.
yourself. Stay home. Do not go out. Wear your mask. Make sure you wear your gloves. It's
Yeah,
important, Maskun. It's
Yes,
important, okay?
thank
Because
you.
this pandemic is going to go on and on and on for the next 1 year, 1 to 2 years, yeah? So I do not know
Yeah.
when will be the next time I'll see you again,
Okay.
yeah? But
Okay, bro.
thank you so much, guys. Take care. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Bye. Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam, bro.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye.